Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You look at the financial ledgers of a fractured, bankrupt state, trying to figure out how they are keeping their economy afloat.
Right.
And you realize the currency being used to buy weapons, settle debts, and pay taxes is not gold, and it is not silver.
Yeah, it's human beings.
Exactly. The currency is human beings. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a massive stack of sources: diplomatic letters, demographic records, military logs.
Just a really heavy amount of primary historical accounts.
Yeah. And we are using all of this to unpack the Kingdom of Imereti. This was a pivotal, often misunderstood state in western Georgia that emerged from the collapse of a unified Georgian monarchy in the late 15th century. And it basically fought tooth and nail until its ultimate annexation by the Russian Empire in 1810.
And looking through these documents, the story of Imereti is essentially a masterclass in the absolute extremes of state survival.
It really is.
For anyone trying to understand this specific part of our Caucasian history series, you really have to look at Imereti not as a traditional stable kingdom with neat borders.
Right, it's not a neat little state on a map.
No, it's a geopolitical pressure cooker. This is a state navigating brutal feudal anarchy, a devastating internal slave trade, and just this relentless tug-of-war between the Ottoman, Safavid, and Russian empires.
So we are dealing with geography, a wildly overpowered nobility, and borderland geopolitics basically shaping the destiny of a nation.
Exactly.
So let us jump straight into the turbulent origins of this kingdom because, the context of how Imereti was born really dictates everything that follows.
It absolutely does.
We know the unified kingdom of Georgia hit its golden age back in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the sources show that by the mid-15th century, dynastic civil wars had completely torn the realm apart.
Yeah, completely fractured it.
Right. And we get this massive clash in 1463, the Battle of Chikori.
Right, 1463.
A powerful noble named Bagrat VI defeats the Georgian King Georgi VIII, captures the historic western capital of Kutaisi, and establishes the independent Bagrationi monarchy of Imereti.
And the documents from this era are so interesting because they reveal that this fracture was not just some sudden political disagreement.
It was something much deeper.
No,
right?
absolutely. To understand why Bagrat VI could break away so successfully, we really have to look at a profound, long-term structural collapse of the unified Georgian state.
The foundation had been cracking for quite a while.
For 2 centuries, actually. The decline really started with the Mongol invasions of the 1220s and 1230s, which imposed heavy tribute and basically shattered central authority.
But the fatal blows came a bit later.
Yeah, the unrecoverable blows came from Timur's campaigns between 1386 and 1403.
I was looking at the demographic estimates from those campaigns in the research, and the numbers are just staggering.
They really are.
We are not just talking about battles here. We were talking about the eradication of entire regions.
Completely. Timur's armies razed cities to the foundations. They deliberately depopulated vast agricultural zones.
Just wipe them off the map?
Yeah, and by the time we reach the mid-15th century, you compound those wars with outbreaks of the plague, and the population of Georgia had effectively been cut in half.
Half the population.
Right. And when a medieval state loses 50% of its population, the entire economic and military apparatus just evaporates.
Because there is no one left to work the system.
Exactly. Centralized tax collection fails entirely because there are not enough farmers producing a surplus.
And without taxes, you cannot fund an army.
Right. The military levies that the central king relies upon can no longer be mustered. The fighting age men are just, they are dead or displaced.
I think it really helps to visualize this structural collapse by comparing the unified kingdom to a sprawling, heavily mortgaged aristocratic estate.
Oh, that is a good way to look at it.
Right. So the central manor house, which represents the king's centralized power, has essentially burned to the ground.
Right.
The patriarch is gone, or he's completely powerless. So the distant relatives who live in the various wings and outbuildings, the regional nobles, they realize nobody is in charge anymore.
Yeah, they are totally on their own.
And more importantly, nobody's coming to protect them. So they violently claim whatever acreage they currently reside on, setting up their own fences and hoarding whatever resources they have left.
That analogy perfectly captures the psychology of the 15th century. The devolution of power was literally an act of brutal physical survival.
They didn't really have a choice.
No, not at all. These local warlords, these regional dukes and princes, they had to prioritize defending their own immediate valleys against incursions.
It was pure local defense.
Right. Serving a distant capital that could no longer pay them or send an army to defend them made absolutely no strategic sense.
So when Burgrat VI breaks away, it's just formalizing a reality.
Exactly. When he established his rule in Kutaisi after the Battle of Chikori, he was simply formalizing a separation that geography, economics, and warfare had already dictated on the ground.
But looking at Burgrat VI's actions, the sources show he did not just want to build a fence and hide in the west.
No, he was very ambitious.
Right. He still harbored this dream of ruling the entire reunited estate. I mean, in 1465, he actually launched a massive military campaign to take back Kartli, which is the eastern region of Georgia.
He did.
He even captured it briefly, declaring himself king of all Georgia.
He did, but the union was incredibly fragile, and Kartli slipped from his grasp just a year later, by 1466.
Which is a pretty fast collapse.
Very fast, and that failure is crucial. It demonstrated that while Burgrat VI could secure the immediate borders of his western domain, the internal structure he inherited was fundamentally unstable.
It was built on sand.
Entirely built on a foundation of sand. Because he relied on those deeply entrenched, overempowered regional warlords to provide his troops, he could not maintain a sustained campaign.
Right, they just wanted to go home, defend their own lands.
Exactly. So he spent the rest of his reign desperately trying to curb the autonomy of these regional dukes just to maintain a baseline of control over Imereti proper.
And that leads us directly to 1490,
Right.
where the formal division of Georgia is finally recognized.
Right, 1490.
The dream of a unified realm is officially put to rest, and the map is split into 3 separate kingdoms: Kartli, Kakheti, and our focus today, Imereti.
And that recognition in 1490 was essentially just diplomatic exhaustion.
Everyone was just too tired to fight.
Basically, yeah. The warring factions realized that no single monarch had the military or economic capacity to subdue the others. They accepted the fragmentation because continuing the civil war would have left them completely defenseless against external threats.
Which were definitely looming. So let us look at the actual physical and social landscape of this newly formalized Kingdom of Imereti.
Geography is huge here.
It is. Geographically, the research highlights that it was centered in the Rioni River Basin. And the borders are very clearly defined by the terrain.
Very much so.
You have the Liki Range to the east, acting as a massive physical wall separating Imereti from the eastern Georgian kingdoms. To the north, you have the towering Greater Caucasus Mountains, and to the south, the Meskheti Range.
As we said, geography is destiny here. The rugged, mountainous terrain of Imereti completely dictated a highly decentralized social structure.
How so?
Well, the society relied heavily on a rigid feudal hierarchy. At the theoretical top was the king. Below him were the high nobles, known as the Tavadi, or princes, and the Matabari, or chiefs.
And below them.
Then came the Asnari, the vassal knights who provided the actual cavalry and infantry levies. The Orthodox Church also held a parallel position of immense independent power.
Right.
And at the absolute bottom were the peasants, both free and dependent.
So I want to stop and unpack this Safavid system that is mentioned so heavily in the sources. Because, on paper, it says the king's power was absolute.
On paper, sure.
But looking at how the Safavid system functioned on the ground, it seems like a complete contradiction to that.
It is the ultimate contradiction of the Imeretian state. The Safavid system essentially refers to the vast hereditary estates controlled by the high nobility.
Okay.
The king's authority was practically non-existent outside his immediate royal lands around the capital of Kutaisi. The Tavadi and Tavari controlled their own massive domains.
They were basically running their own mini kingdoms.
Exactly. They collected their own revenues, administered their own justice, and critically, they commanded their own private armies.
Which raises a really glaring logistical question. If I am the king of Imereti, how do I actually govern when my own generals, the people supposed to be leading my armies, are essentially rival kings with their own sovereign territories?
Well, you govern through constant, exhausting negotiation.
Sounds terrible.
It was. Negotiation, bribery, and the threat of military intimidation. The king did not have a professional, centralized, standing army.
So he had to ask for troops.
Right. If he needed to defend the borders or enforce a tax collection, he had to ask his high nobles to bring their private troops. And if a noble decided he did not like the king's policy, he simply kept his army at home, paralyzing the state.
The sources also detail this royal advisory council called the Darbazi. My initial thought was that this would be an instrument for the king to project his administration.
Right, that would make sense.
But it looks like it functioned as the exact opposite.
Yeah, the Darbazi was dominated by the high nobility and the top hierarchs of the Orthodox Church. Instead of projecting royal authority, the Darbazi operated almost exclusively to protect noble interests.
So it was a check on the king.
A massive check. They advised the king on war, taxation, and succession. If a monarch tried to assert too much centralized control, the Darbazi could effectively veto his decisions or, in extreme cases, legitimize a rebellion against him.
So it is no wonder that regional principalities like Goria, Mingrelia, and Abkhazia began operating with de facto independence by the 16th century.
Technically, those regions were part of the Kingdom of Imereti, but their rulers acted as sovereigns in their own right.
They completely ignored the king.
Pretty much. They frequently defied royal edicts, signed their own treaties, and even encroached on the king's lands in Imereti proper whenever the throne showed weakness.
Let us ground this in some demographic reality, because the sources give us some specific population details for the late 18th century.
Yeah, the numbers are interesting.
The kingdom had about 113,000 inhabitants spread across roughly 19,000 households. This is a profoundly agrarian society.
Almost entirely.
The vast majority of the population is strictly tied to the land, living in highly dispersed, isolated villages in these river valleys.
And that agrarian base is the entire engine of the economy. The nobility, the church, and the crown sustain themselves entirely through what is known as corvée labor, along with taking a massive cut of the peasantry's harvests.
Let us clarify corvée labor for the listener, because it is a crucial mechanism of how this society functioned. We are not talking about peasants paying a cash rent to live on the land.
No, a monetized economy barely existed outside the major trading hubs. Corvée labor meant that a peasant was legally obligated to perform a set number of days or weeks of unpaid, back-breaking physical labor directly on the noble's personal estate.
So what did that actually look like day to day?
This could mean plowing the lord's fields, repairing his fortress walls, or cutting timber. The peasant gives their labor, and a portion of their own crop yields simply for the right to exist on the land and receive theoretical military protection from the lord.
And the vulnerability of that specific agrarian system becomes the central tragedy of Imereti. Because right as the kingdom is trying to figure out this internal balancing act between the king and the nobles, the external world shifts dramatically.
It really does.
In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquers Constantinople.
The fall of Constantinople was a geopolitical earthquake for the entire Caucasus.
It changed everything.
Everything. For centuries, the Georgian kingdoms had relied on the Byzantine Empire and European trade networks via the Black Sea. When the Ottomans took Constantinople, they effectively locked the door to the Black Sea.
So they are trapped.
Yes. Georgia was suddenly and completely severed from its traditional European allies, its diplomatic lifelines, and its crucial trade routes.
And it did not take long for that isolation to turn into a direct physical threat. In 1509, during the reign of the Imeretian king Alexander II, the Ottomans launched their first major invasion of the kingdom.
They came in hard.
They pushed all the way to the capital, sacking Kutaisi, and deliberately burned the Gelati monastery.
And burning Gelati was a calculated psychological blow. The monastery was not just a church.
Right.
It was the spiritual and cultural heart of Western Georgia, a real symbol of their golden age. That invasion marked the beginning of centuries of relentless, suffocating pressure.
Just constant attack.
Yeah, and by 1555, the geopolitical reality of the region was formalized in the Treaty of Amasya. The Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire of Persia essentially drew a line down the map, partitioning the Caucasus into respective spheres of influence.
So where did Imereti fall?
Western Georgia, encompassing the entirety of Imereti, was formally designated as a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire.
Now, let us look closely at the mechanics of this vassalage. Because initially, I assumed vassalage meant a full military occupation. But the research points out that the Ottomans did not actually want to occupy Imereti with their own troops.
No, they didn't.
Why not just take it over completely?
Yeah.
I mean, they had the power.
It comes down to a harsh cost-benefit analysis by the Ottoman military planners. The terrain of western Georgia is rugged, mountainous, densely forested, and severely lacking in infrastructure.
So it's hard to hold.
Extremely hard. Maintaining a permanent, large-scale garrison there would require massive supply lines that would constantly be subjected to guerrilla attacks by highly experienced local warlords. It was a logistical nightmare.
So what did they do instead?
The Ottomans preferred indirect control. They wanted compliance, a secure border buffer against the Safavids to the east, and steady resource extraction.
But the tribute they demanded for this indirect control was extraordinarily steep. The Ottomans demanded raw wealth, agricultural goods, and, most devastatingly, an annual quota of human slaves.
The demand for human tribute is what completely transformed the socio-economic fabric of Imereti. It initiated an era of severe moral and economic decay that would just rot the kingdom from the inside out.
Think about the strategic nightmare this creates for Imereti. You are legally recognized as a buffer state for the Ottoman Empire against Safavid Persia.
Right.
Your entire geopolitical purpose, in the eyes of Istanbul, is to absorb the tension and violence between two massive Islamic superpowers. And to pay for the privilege of not being fully invaded by your overlords, you have to export your own population.
It's incredibly dark. And that horrific dynamic catalyzes the worst period in Georgian history, leading us directly into the severe feudal anarchy of the 17th century.
The political instability during this era is just staggering. The records show that between 1677 and 1744, a period of just 67 years, 15 different kings ascended and fell from the Imeretian throne.
15 kings.
15 kings in 67 years. That is barely 4 years per reign on average. It implies a state of permanent civil war.
It was a chaotic revolving door. Powerful, noble families, specifically the Abashidze, the Dadyani of Mingrelia, and the Gurieli of Guria, they realized that a weak king allowed them to operate with total impunity.
So they kept turning over the kings.
Exactly. So they frequently formed shifting alliances against the crown, deposing kings who attempted to centralize authority and installing pliant puppet replacements. And this relentless internal chaos fueled the absolute worst aspect of this era, the tikioba, or the local slave trade.
The mechanics of the tikioba are vital to understand because it is not just a tragedy, it is an economic mechanism.
It's purely economic.
We established earlier that the treasury is empty, and agricultural output is constantly disrupted by these nobles fighting each other. So how do they fund their wars?
Well, when crops are burning and gold is scarce, human beings literally become the primary currency. The Imeretian nobles actively captured and sold their own peasants, their own subjects, to Ottoman slave markets.
Going back to our estate analogy, the relatives living on the estate are not just claiming the land anymore.
No.
We are literally kidnapping the gardeners, the cooks, and the blacksmiths and selling them to rival estates just to buy pitchforks and swords to fight their own cousins. It is absolute societal cannibalism.
Cannibalism is the exact word for it. They sold the very people required to farm the land and generate the structural wealth of the territory. Nobles sold their peasants to pay off debts, to purchase firearms from coastal traders, or to eliminate domestic political enemies.
It sounds highly organized.
It became a highly organized, lucrative network. Ottoman merchants, rogue Georgian nobles, and sometimes even official Ottoman administrators governing the broader Caucasus region engaged directly in this trade.
It was an industry.
A massive industry. Every year, hundreds of Georgian, Circassian, and Abkhazian captives were funneled down to the coastal forts and shipped across the Black Sea to the slave markets of Istanbul.
The economic death spiral here is terrifying. You sell your agricultural workforce to buy weapons, you use the weapons to fight your neighbor.
Right.
The fighting destroys whatever crops are left, creating famine and deeper poverty. The poverty creates an even more desperate need for wealth, so you capture and sell more people.
A perfect historical illustration of this horrific era is the Battle of Rokiti in 1684. King Alexander IV was desperately trying to consolidate royal authority and stop the hemorrhaging of royal power.
So what happens?
He found himself facing an open, heavily armed rebellion led by George IV Gurieli, the ruler of Guria, and Shoshida II, the immensely powerful Duke of Racha.
So the sitting monarch has to march out and fight a major pitched battle against his own ostensible generals and governors, just to maintain the absolute bare minimum illusion that he is still the king.
Precisely. Alexander IV managed to win the Battle of Rokiti, which temporarily reasserted dominance over those specific separatist forces.
But I'm guessing it didn't last.
No, the victory was hollow. It highlights the fundamental reality of 17th century Imereti. The king was no longer a sovereign monarch. He was just one warlord among many, struggling to keep his head above water in a sea of endless feudal rebellion and demographic collapse.
Moving into the early 18th century, the situation reaches a breaking point. The system simply cannot sustain itself anymore.
It was bound to collapse.
At the very start of the century, The most powerful noble in the kingdom, a man named Georgi, essentially seizes total control of the state apparatus.
He sidelined the king entirely.
He sidelines the reigning monarch and makes an incredibly drastic, terrifying gamble. He completely refuses to pay the annual tribute, including the human quota, to the Ottoman Empire.
Abbasid's realized that if the Tifioba continued, there would literally be no population left to rule. He wanted to strengthen the internal economy and throw off the Ottoman yoke.
That is a bold move.
And initially, his defiance sparked a wave of unity. The other powerful regional lords, like the Gurieli and Dadiani, followed his lead and also refused their tribute. Even the Abkhazians in the northwest rose up and actively attacked Ottoman merchants. It was a massive, coordinated regional defiance of Ottoman authority.
But you do not simply stop paying tribute to one of the most powerful empires on earth without severe consequences.
No, you definitely don't.
In 1703, the Ottomans retaliate with massive force. They send the Beylerbey of Erzurum, Kozyalı Pasha, with a large professional army to completely crush the rebellion and restore absolute dominance.
Let us clarify the term Beylerbey. It translates roughly to commander of commanders or a senior provincial governor.
So he's a very big deal.
A huge deal. Kozyalı Pasha was a high-ranking military official tasked with coordinating a massive logistical operation. The Ottoman army entered western Georgia from 3 different strategic directions to overwhelm the defenders.
They really wanted to make an example of them.
Absolutely. Kozyalı Pasha personally advanced into Guriya in the south. Another commander, Ishak Pasha, seized the vital Zakaria mountain passes to block any reinforcements. Concurrently, the Ottoman Navy landed amphibious troops on the coast of Mingrelia.
They are executing a highly coordinated, multi-front invasion. And the sources note they brought along a Bagrationi prince named Georgi with the explicit intention of installing him as a puppet king once they wiped out Abbasid's.
That was standard imperial procedure?
The initial phases of the invasion were highly successful. They captured key coastal forts like Poti, Anakli, and Rui and began building new garrisons to lock down the territory. Imereti was essentially finished.
It really was.
But then the geopolitical canvas shifts abruptly due to an incredible stroke of sheer blind luck.
It is one of the most remarkable coincidences in the history of the region. Just as the Ottomans were preparing to launch the final, crushing blow into the heart of Imereti, the entire campaign was suddenly halted by an event occurring hundreds of miles away, the Edirne incident.
The research details this, and it is fascinating how a domestic dispute in an entirely different country saved the Imeretian kingdom. What exactly was the Edirne incident?
So in July 1703, a massive domestic rebellion erupted in Istanbul. The Janissaries, the elite infantry units of the Ottoman military, along with artillerymen and various powerful trade guilds, completely revolted against Sultan Mustafa II.
Why were they revolting?
They were furious about neglected pay, massive inflation, and the overwhelming corrupt influence of the Sultan's chief cleric, Seyhulislam Feyzullah Efendi. An army of 60,000 furious rebels mobilized in Istanbul and marched directly on the city of Edirne, where the Sultan was holding court.
60,000 rebels marching on the Sultan's palace. That is a full-blown revolution.
Yes, it was.
The Sultan was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his brother, Ahmet III, and that highly unpopular chief cleric was violently killed.
Now imagine you are Kozyalı Pasha sitting in a war camp in western Georgia preparing to take Kutaisi. Suddenly, a courier arrives and tells you that the Sultan who ordered this invasion has been overthrown, the capital is in chaos, and the new administration needs the army back immediately to secure the empire.
Wow, so he just had to stop everything.
He had to abandon the full conquest of Imereti instantly.
He cannot just pack up and leave without securing some kind of deal, right?
He had to act fast. He quickly negotiated a hasty settlement with Georgi Abashidze. The terms heavily favored the Ottomans on paper. They demanded the demolition of the heavily fortified Shorapani fortress, the immediate return of any Ottoman captives, and they forced the installation of their puppet prince as King George VI.
So they got some concessions.
Yes, but in reality, this sudden forced withdrawal gave Imereti a brief, desperate respite from total annihilation.
But even with that miraculous respite, the subsequent decades were incredibly difficult for the kingdom. The kings of Imereti, who followed, like George VI and later Alexander V, were locked in a miserable, desperate balancing act.
They were walking a tightrope over a very deep chasm.
Right.
They had to constantly appease the Ottoman governors to prevent another invasion force from returning, while simultaneously fighting off their own rebellious nobles.
And the nobles were not helping.
Not at all. The nobles, realizing the king was weakened by Ottoman demands, would frequently send secret envoys to Istanbul, inviting Ottoman forces in to help overthrow the monarch if he tried to assert any local authority.
It's just a constant cycle of betrayal.
To break this agonizing cycle of appeasement and betrayal, the Imeretian kings began to look north. They started to secretly court the emerging superpower, the Russian Empire under Tsar Peter I.
This shift toward Russia becomes especially critical after 1722, because in that year, the geopolitical map of the Middle East fundamentally fractures when the Safavid dynasty in Persia collapses.
The collapse of the Safavids created a massive, highly dangerous power vacuum across the entire Caucasus region. In 1722, an Afghan revolt, led by a warlord named Mir Mahmud, captured the Safavid capital of Isfahan.
So Persia is in chaos.
Total chaos. Seeing their longtime Persian rival completely disintegrate into chaos, Tsar Peter I of Russia saw a historic opportunity. He launched a massive military expedition southward with an army of over 100,000 men.
Over 100,000 men?
Yeah, aiming to capture the lucrative Caspian seacoast and establish a permanent Russian military presence in the Caucasus.
And naturally, the Ottomans are not going to just sit back and watch Russia absorb the Persian Empire's northern territories.
Exactly. The Ottomans mobilized their own massive armies, quickly capturing key regional hubs like Tiflis, Yerevan, and Ganja.
It's a land grab.
A huge one. For a tense moment, it looked like the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were going to fight a devastating war over the carcass of Safavid Persia. But diplomacy prevailed, and they reached an agreement in 1724, mutually partitioning the territory between them.
During all of this high-level imperial maneuvering, what are the kings of Imereti doing?
They are desperately sending envoys to the Russian court. Both the kings of Imereti and Kartli were hoping to secure a formal military alliance with Tsar Peter. They were hoping Russian troops could permanently dislodge the Ottoman garrisons from western Georgia.
But did Russia actually care about them?
Not really. Russian strategic interests were focused heavily on the Caspian coast and the Baltic Sea. Their support for the Georgians was highly sporadic, often consisting of vague promises that ultimately left the Imeretian kings horribly exposed to severe Ottoman retaliation.
So this constant cycle of appeasing the Ottomans, fighting rebellious nobles, and chasing empty promises from Russia left Imereti completely hollowed out.
Absolutely drained.
By the mid-18th century, the kingdom was exhausted. It was primed for a ruler who finally decided that the only viable path to saving the nation was through absolute, uncompromising resistance.
And that ruler arrives in the form of King Solomon I, who reigned from 1752 to 1784.
Often recognized as the Great Restorer.
Yes. Solomon I looked at the situation and correctly diagnosed that the internal rot caused by the slave trade and the wildly autonomous nobility was just as dangerous to the state's survival as the Ottoman armies sitting on the border.
His very first major policy directive upon taking the throne was outlawing the tifioba entirely. He makes the slave trade illegal.
Banning the slave trade was a massive, incredibly dangerous political move.
It really was.
It was a direct strike at the economic foundation of his own rebellious nobility, who relied on that trade for their wealth and weapons. And simultaneously, it was a direct, open defiance of the Ottoman tribute system.
So he just made enemies out of everyone.
Pretty much. Naturally, this provoked massive, immediate backlash from the nobles. In his very first year on the throne, rebel noblemen successfully staged a coup and overthrew him.
But the sources show he did not give up. He manages to rally loyalist forces, regains the throne, and when he comes back into power, he does not offer pardons. He severely punishes the disloyal nobles.
He fundamentally dismantled their power bases. A key example is in 1769. He targets the powerful Duke of Racha, a man named Rostam, who had been a perpetual thorn in the side of the monarchy.
What did he do to him?
Solomon did not just defeat Rostam in battle, he captured him, blinded him, and completely abolished the Racha Sarajevo, the actual duchy itself.
He just erased it.
He erased a major historical center of feudal opposition from the map, absorbing the lands directly into the royal domain.
Beyond his internal political ruthlessness, Solomon I was a highly capable military tactician. He realized that the traditional Imeretian strategy of hiding behind static castle defenses and waiting out an Ottoman siege was mathematically doomed to fail.
You can't win a war of attrition against an empire.
Right. So he fundamentally modernized his tactics, and the prime example of this is the Battle of Kresili, fought on December 14, 1757.
The Battle of Kresili is a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. The Ottomans, furious over the ban on the slave trade and the withholding of tribute, sent a large, heavily armed, punitive army to crush Solomon and replace him with a compliant noble.
But Solomon does not meet them on an open field where Ottoman artillery and line infantry would decimate his forces. He secretly unifies a core loyalist force and deliberately lures the Ottoman army deep into a trap.
He utilized the brutally rugged, mountainous terrain of Imereti as a weapon. He knew the Ottomans relied on long, vulnerable supply lines to move their cannons and provisions through the narrow valleys.
So he cuts them off.
Exactly. Solomon staged massive ambushes, cutting off their supply routes, and forced the enemy army to fight in tight, heavily forested gorges where their numerical superiority and artillery were completely neutralized.
That is brilliant.
It is. The Imeretian highlanders, fighting on their home terrain, descended on the trapped Ottoman columns. At Kresili, Solomon delivered a massive, decisive defeat to the Ottoman forces. He essentially wiped out the invasion force, proving to Istanbul and to his own nobles that Imereti could defend itself dynamically and offensively.
It is brilliant tactical adaptation. But looking at his broader diplomatic strategy, it is clear he knew he could not sustain this level of resistance entirely alone.
No, winning one battle does not win a war against an empire.
So in 1758, he forms a crucial binding military alliance with King Ercole II, the powerful monarch of Kartli in eastern Georgia. They sign a treaty pledging to mutually support each other against any external threats.
Effectively trying to recreate a unified Georgian defensive front.
Right. It was a vital alliance.
But Solomon also recognized the immense utility of Russian military power, which was growing more aggressive in the region. During the major Russo-Turkish War that spanned from 1768 to 1774, Solomon made a highly strategic calculation. He actively invited Russian imperial troops into Imereti.
He essentially offers Imereti as a second front against the Ottomans for the Russian commanders.
Exactly. He coordinated joint military operations with the Russian forces. By utilizing Russian artillery and engineering, he was able to systematically besiege and clear out the entrenched Ottoman garrisons that had occupied key Imeretian forts like Shorapani and Baghdadi for decades.
In 1774, the research shows Solomon went even further. He actually dispatched an official ambassador directly to the court of Empress Catherine II of Russia, officially proposing that the Kingdom of Imereti become a formal Russian protectorate in exchange for permanent, guaranteed military aid against the Ottomans.
And the Russian response at that specific time was non-committal. Catherine II was focused heavily on securing the Crimea and dealing with internal Russian rebellions, so they sent some aid, but declined the formal protectorate.
But the crucial precedent was set.
Yes, the door was opened. Solomon I successfully restored the dignity, stability, and a degree of genuine sovereignty to Imereti. He held the Ottoman Empire at bay, abolished the horrific slave trade, and forced the fractured nobility to submit to the central crown.
However, his reliance on Russian military aid to achieve those goals opened a geopolitical door. And it is a door that subsequent Imeretian kings would find absolutely impossible to close.
That vulnerability becomes violently apparent the moment he is gone. Solomon I died in 1784, and tragically, he died without leaving a clear, adult, unchallenged heir.
Which is always a disaster.
Almost instantly, the kingdom, which had been stable for decades, was plunged right back into a devastating, ruinous civil war.
The nobility, who had been brutally suppressed by Solomon for 30 years, immediately fracture back to their rival factions. They split their support between two main contenders for the vacant throne. The first is David, who is the son of Georgi. The second contender is also named David, but he is the son of Archel.
To understand the massive geopolitical stakes of this succession, you have to look at the family tree. David, the son of Archel, was not just an Imeretian royal. He was the grandson of King Ercole II, that immensely powerful monarch of the neighboring eastern Georgian kingdom of Kartli.
So this internal succession crisis rapidly transforms into a massive proxy war.
It does.
King Ercole II intervenes heavily, sending troops and resources to place his own grandson on the throne of Imereti. And looking at the sources, this completely terrifies a significant faction of the Imeretian high nobility.
Oh, they are terrified.
They realize that if Ercole's grandson becomes their king, it will likely lead to the total structural absorption of Imereti by the eastern kingdom of Kartli, forever stripping them of their regional autonomy and power.
So that terrified faction of nobles violently rallies behind the other contender, David, the son of Georgi, and a brutal, highly destructive conflict ensues across the western valleys.
With the active military intervention of Ercole II's forces, combined with the loyalist Imeretian nobles, David the son of Arkell eventually wins the throne in 1789. He takes the regal name Solomon II, clearly trying to project the strength of his formidable predecessor.
He took the throne, but the defeated David, George's son, did not simply accept exile and fade away. He spent the entire decade of the 1790s launching continuous, deeply destabilizing plots and full-scale invasions.
He just wouldn't let it go.
He repeatedly crossed into Imereti using massive mercenary forces provided by the Ottoman Pasha of Akhaltsika, as well as hardened fighters hired from the mountainous regions of Dagestan.
This relentless pressure forces the new king, Solomon II, into a state of constant, exhausting military mobilization. The kingdom is bled dry.
Completely bled dry.
The endless internal wars, the massive cost of paying and fighting mercenary armies, the deliberate burning of agricultural crops, it completely drained whatever economic and human resources Solomon I had spent 30 years painstakingly rebuilding.
Solomon II does eventually manage to stabilize his realm by the late 1790s, but the structural damage to the state was profound.
This situation poses a classic, tragic geopolitical trap. The various Imeretian factions actively sought external military help to solve their internal disputes. They invited the Ottomans, the Dagestanis, the Eastern Georgians, and eventually the Russians into their politics.
Right.
But the harsh lesson of history is that when you invite a massive neighboring empire to send armies to settle your internal family feud, the empire usually decides to simply keep the house for themselves once the fighting is done.
And that dynamic becomes an existential, terrifying reality in 1801. In that year, the Russian Empire issues an imperial decree from St. Petersburg formally abolishing the Kingdom of Kartli-Kakheti in eastern Georgia.
They just annex it entirely.
Entirely. Directly into the Russian Empire. The Russian administration violently deposes the Bagrationi royal family there and establishes direct bureaucratic military control.
For Solomon II, sitting in his palace in Kutaisi, watching his powerful eastern neighbor, a kingdom ruled by his own relatives, simply be erased from the map by the stroke of a Russian pen must have been absolutely horrifying.
The eastern buffer was gone. The borders of the massive Russian Empire were now pressed directly against his eastern mountain ranges.
And following the successful annexation of eastern Georgia, the Russian imperial administration immediately turns its sights toward the west. The key figure here is General Pavel Tsitsinov, the highly aggressive Russian commander tasked with subjugating the Caucasus.
He was known for being ruthless.
He begins applying severe military and diplomatic pressure directly on Solomon II.
Tsitsinov was not interested in alliances. He was interested in total submission. In April 1804, he marched a heavily armed Russian column directly to the Imeretian border and essentially forced Solomon II, under the threat of immediate invasion, to sign the Treaty of Aleznori.
Looking at the terms of this treaty, it drastically alters the reality of the kingdom. Under Aleznori, the independent Kingdom of Imereti officially becomes a protectorate of the Russian Empire.
Right, a protectorate.
Solomon II is allowed to nominally retain his throne and his control over local internal administration, but he has to publicly accept Russian suzerainty, align his foreign policy entirely with St. Petersburg, and crucially, allow permanent Russian military garrisons to be stationed strategically on his territory.
Solomon accepted this deeply humiliating treaty under immense duress. He likely rationalized it, hoping that formal Russian protection would shield his fragile kingdom from further Ottoman incursions, and perhaps secure his throne against internal rivals who were still plotting against him.
But it was a fragile deal.
Very fragile. The protectorate was inherently unstable, and the treaty quickly began to break down.
The breakdown was inevitable because the two sides had completely different interpretations of the treaty. Solomon thought he was buying a permanent shield. The Russian imperial administration viewed the protectorate merely as a temporary, transitional stepping stone to full, outright annexation.
Exactly. They were just biding their time.
By 1810, the authorities in St. Petersburg and Tbilisi decided that even a compliant vassal king in western Georgia was a dangerous impediment to their strategic goal of absolute, uncontested control of the Caucasus region.
So in February 1810, the Russian administration dropped the pretense of diplomacy. They issued an official decree legally deposing Solomon II, stripping him of his royal titles.
Just unilaterally deposing him.
Yes. To enforce this decree, they dispatched a highly trained force of 3,200 troops, commanded by Lieutenant General Rosen, to physically occupy the kingdom, seize the capital, and enforce the total annexation of Imereti.
But Solomon II refuses to submit quietly to a bureaucratic decree. He makes a desperate, heroic final stand.
He really did.
He rallies the remaining loyalist nobles and fiercely independent peasants, retreating from the capital and fortifying himself in the incredibly rugged, defensible terrain of the Conasquali Valley.
He knew he could not defeat the Russian army in a pitched battle, so he engaged in a frantic, wide-ranging diplomatic campaign. He sent desperate appeals to anyone who might intervene.
Anyone at all.
Right. He reached out to his old enemies, the Ottoman Empire. He sent envoys to the Shah of Persia. He even attempted to contact Napoleonic France, begging for military intervention or diplomatic pressure to save his kingdom from total Russian domination.
But the geopolitical timing was completely against him. None of those powers were in any position or had the logistical desire to send an army deep into western Georgia just to fight the Russians over a minor kingdom.
No, he was entirely on his own.
Despite incredibly stubborn resistance, and utilizing the same difficult mountainous terrain that had saved them from the Ottomans at Crisili decades earlier, the Imeretian loyalists were simply heavily outmatched.
They were facing an organized, heavily supplied, artillery-equipped Russian imperial army that was experienced in mountain warfare.
Solomon was eventually cornered, defeated, and physically captured by Russian forces. Incredibly, while awaiting transport, he managed to stage a daring, dramatic escape from his captors.
It's quite the story.
He fled through the mountains and crossed the border into the Ottoman Empire. He spent his final tragic years living in exile, wandering between courts, trying in vain to rally international support for a lost cause. He eventually died of illness in the Ottoman city of Trabzon in 1815.
A really sad end.
Yeah. But officially, on February 20, 1810, the Kingdom of Imereti was formally and legally erased. It was absorbed into the vast Russian Empire, downgraded to a mere administrative district known as an oblast.
The royal line of the Bagrationi dynasty in western Georgia, a family that had ruled the region in various forms for centuries, was entirely stripped of its sovereignty.
The Russian authorities immediately moved in and began integrating the region into their rigid, centralized administrative framework, deliberately ignoring complex local customs, traditional laws, and deeply entrenched power structures.
But dissolving a sovereign kingdom by issuing a bureaucratic decree in St. Petersburg and marching an army into the capital does not magically dissolve the culture, the pride, and the identity of the people living in those valleys.
No, it definitely doesn't.
The sudden forced transition sparked massive, deep-seated resentment across all levels of Imeretian society.
And looking at the sources, that simmering resentment violently explodes just a few years later. Between 1819 and 1820, the entire region of western Georgia was engulfed in a massive uprising known as the Church Rebellion.
The trigger for this rebellion is incredibly revealing. The Russian imperial administration, seeking to consolidate absolute control, attempted to forcibly subordinate the fiercely independent Imeretian Orthodox Church.
They went after the church.
Yeah, they initiated policies to confiscate vast tracts of lucrative church properties. They tried to introduce direct, heavy state taxation on clerical lands, which had traditionally been exempt. And most offensively to the local population, they began attempting to alter centuries-old Georgian liturgical traditions to strictly match Russian Orthodox practices.
This aggressive, tone-deaf intervention into the spiritual life of the region was a massive miscalculation by the Russian governors. They alienated absolutely everyone.
No one.
They alienated the clergy, obviously, but they also alienated the surviving local nobility and the vast peasantry. For the people of Imereti, the church was no longer just a religious institution. With the monarchy gone, the church was the absolute last surviving pillar of their distinct Georgian identity.
What began as a defensive political stance by church leaders against taxation rapidly escalated into a massive, heavily armed guerrilla war that encompassed not just Imereti, but the neighboring regions of Racha and Guria as well.
It spread fast.
Very fast. The rebels utilized the exact same brutally rugged terrain that King Solomon I had used against the Ottomans a generation earlier. They launched devastating ambushes against Russian imperial garrisons, severed supply lines, and made the territory virtually ungovernable for months.
The rebellion was eventually brutally suppressed by overwhelming Russian military reinforcements, but the intensity of the violence grew to a crucial point. It demonstrated that the spirit of independence in western Georgia remained fierce, forcing the Russian administration to keep the region heavily militarized and in a state of underlying tension for decades to come.
When we take a step back and connect this incredibly dense, turbulent history to the bigger picture, it forces us to deeply evaluate the long-term strategies of survival adopted by small, fractured states that are geographically trapped and surrounded by massive, expanding empires.
It leaves you with a really profound, somewhat tragic reflection on the true cost of survival. The Kingdom of Imereti managed to survive centuries of relentless invasions, economic blockades, and tribute demands from the absolute greatest Islamic empires of the age, the Ottomans and the Safavids.
They held out for a remarkably long time.
They survived by utilizing their incredibly rugged terrain, by leveraging the fierce, almost anarchic independence of their regional nobility, and by masterfully playing their massive enemies against each other. Yet the kingdom was ultimately undone and erased from the map by a slow, creeping assimilation from a fellow Orthodox Christian empire, an empire that the desperate Imeretian kings initially invited into their own lands, hoping for protection. It leaves you to question the true, often hidden cost of security when a small nation decides that the only way to solve its internal problems is to rely entirely on the military might of a superpower.
The muddy, chaotic waters of that geopolitical landscape ultimately swallowed the kingdom whole, leaving only the history we have unpacked today.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.